From San Francisco, it's Grumpy Old Doc with Dr. Gene Bede.
Hello, this is Dr. Gene Bede, and welcome to the Grumpy Old Doc. These days, one of the things that makes me grumpiest is reading the newspaper, listening to the radio, watching television. The news really irritates me and makes me grumpy. It seems like I don't agree with anyone. Sometimes I do agree with the Wall Street Journal. It's one of the reasons why I post some of their articles on my Facebook page. And as I was reading it this morning, I saw a word that caught my eye, biosimilar, two separate articles about biosimilars. It was about the entry into the U.S. market of a familiar name, but in an unfamiliar space. Samsung is introducing the first drug in the U.S. market from Samsung. It's a biosimilar drug for Remicade, and it's expected to sell at about a 35% discount over brand Remicade, far cheaper than the one biosimilar that's already on the market that sells for about a 15% discount over the brand. And there was a follow-up article that I posted to my Facebook page about how the bizarre system of rebates and discounts and copays and insurance may mean that many folks may not save money from biosimilars, at least not right away. So let's talk a little bit about biosimilars today. I think there's a little muddied thinking about what they are, who they're for, and what their importance is. If you or someone you know has rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, lymphoma, leukemia, metastatic cancer from the colon, from the lung, from the breast, from the stomach, if they have age-related macular degeneration, and there's a bunch more diseases, but if they have any of these diseases, which are not uncommon, they're not rare, then biosimilars are something that are important to you or to your loved one. Why? Because all of these diseases, cancers, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, are treated with a new class of drugs called biologics. And biologics differ from the kind of pills, potions, ointments, patches, and the sorts of things that Jim Kohler talked about on our show, dispensing from the corner drugstore. Biologics are not manufactured. There's no chemical formula. They're not made in a chemical factory. Biologics are huge molecules that are created using bioreactors and living processes to create these molecules that do these wonderful things, but that we really don't know the exact chemical composition of, let alone how they're folded or how they work at a very microscopic level. And because these molecules are so large, by and large, if you take them in a pill, you don't absorb the active molecule. So they have to be administered with a needle, with a shot, with an IV, one way or another. And the thing that really differentiates biologicals from the stuff you get at your corner drugstore is they're expensive. They run, on average, from about $25,000 a year to about $200,000 a year. And because of that, chances are your insurance benefit looks a little different when you get a biologic drug prescribed to you than if you get a pill or a liquid or some of the usual things. You probably have a fixed copay, amount out of pocket, $50, $60, $10, whatever it is when you get a generic or a brand drug at the drugstore. When it comes to infusible drugs, injectable drugs, biologic drugs, we are generally talking about a percentage, 20%, 30%, 33%. For a drug that costs $300,000 a year, you can do the math pretty quick. 33% is $100,000 out of pocket. For most people, they're fortunate. They have some out-of-pocket cap. So until they hit that cap, they have to burn through that heavy-duty monthly expense, but they hit it pretty quick. It's somewhere around $7,000 for Medicare, and you can compare it in the commercial segment. But that cap is still an important amount of money for a lot of people, and that's a cap that certainly can increase. Employers can look at that cap as a way they can perhaps save some money on their drug costs. Not only are these drugs expensive per unit cost, but they're expensive to the system as a whole. They are really approaching about half of all drug costs in the system. There are about 900 new drugs, miracle drugs, in the pipeline being developed, and are all probably going to be super expensive. About 1 out of every 3 drugs that gets approved, a new drug, is one of these biologic drugs. It's where the drug companies are spending their research dollar. And if we take a look at the top-selling drug in the United States, Humira, and the top 10 selling drugs in the United States in terms of dollars, 8 out of 10 are in the specialty category. How is that when these aren't the most common diseases? Well, they cost on average about 20 times what a prescription that is not a biologic costs. Against that backdrop of what biologic drugs are, biosimilars make their appearance. This is one of the definite upsides of Obamacare, the ACA. Before the ACA, there were no guardrails. There was no guidance for any manufacturer that wanted to produce a drug that was a biologic drug that had gone off patent. The ACA established those guardrails for what are called biosimilar drugs for the first time. And there's 5 of them on the market today. I've heard folks say, well, biosimilars, generics for specialty drugs or biologic drugs. Specialty drug, that's another term that's often used interchangeably with biologics, although it's a little nebulous as well. If I go to my specialist, I go to my shrink and he gives me generic lithium, that's not a specialty drug. It sounds like maybe it should be because it came from a specialist. So specialty drugs, biologic drugs, sort of interchangeable. So I've heard folks say, biosimilars are like generic versions of specialty or biologic drugs. And that's not exactly the case, because in terms of the small molecules, we know the exact chemical formula. We can analyze things to see if it adheres to that formula. We know how a chemical process in a manufacturing plant should look. But these drugs are a little different. It's more like beer than it is fertilizer into the way it's made. And you can say, hey, I've got a beer that tastes just like Pliny the Younger. And it may taste really like it, and most people can't tell the difference. But it's not Pliny the Younger, and you know it's not Pliny the Younger because you don't have the recipe for it. And there's an infinite number of recipes and outcomes for beer. And that's sort of the way it works with biologic. There's an infinite number of recipes. There's probably an infinite number of molecules that have tiny little differences among them that are all essentially equivalent, but they are not identical. They are not the same. So before the ACA, there were no guardrails. There was no ability to approve a generic copy because there were no generic copies. You couldn't prove that your drug was chemically identical to the one you were copying. Now, they've established some guardrails for safety, purity, and potency of biosimilars that hopefully make them more available. Well, how are they going to do it? Well, they're going to do it in a number of ways. They are going to study the molecule and the processes to the limits of our science today. They're going to study their molecule in animals and study it in humans. And the FDA has set some certain criteria. Has to have the same mechanism, has to have the same indications for usage, has to be given in the same route, has to be given in the same dosing strength, and the manufacturing standards has to pass muster to the FDA. So the question is, biosimilars, now we have 5 of them out there. Are they good? Are they bad? Well, it depends on where you stand, how you look, and what you're looking for. It's either an investment opportunity or a risk. If you invest in a company that wins in the biosimilar game, it's an opportunity. If you invest in a company that loses because of biosimilars, it's obviously a risk. Currently, some of the big manufacturers of the branded biologics are hedging their bets by getting a subsidiary involved in producing biosimilars. Others are actively opposing biosimilars and being fairly aggressive. Remember, 8 out of 10 of the top drugs in the United States are biologics. Their profit margins, their market share could all be eroded by biosimilars. Of course the drug companies are going to be excited about this. Compounding things is the fact that about $50 billion worth of annual sales of biologic drugs are going off patent by 2019. This is called a patent cliff. $50 billion worth of product potentially could be replaced in the marketplace by biosimilars. That's why people are saying that if biosimilars really hit the market, they're going to save about $250 billion over the next 10 years. So what are the arguments against biosimilars that the drug companies and others will undoubtedly employ? Well, number one, they're similar. They're not identical. It's not like generics, the drug companies will say. It's much more of an unknown. And this directly plays into people's fears that cost cutting is impacting the quality of the medicine that they get, and to doctors' inherent conservatism. Even with small molecule generics, doctors were very oppositional to that for many years. I even heard doctors talking about how generic naproxen is no good. This is after the stuff became Aleve and is available over the counter. And it's not uncommon today to find a neurologist, for instance, who will specify a brand name drug for seizure medicines for epilepsy patients that he may have. Some of the reason is just conservatism. If somebody doesn't have a seizure, why do you want to mess with things? A lot of it is the fact that these drugs are less than effective. Psychiatric drugs, same sort of thing. There's a huge placebo effect involved. Drug levels may vary for no particular reason. They're difficult drugs to dose. And so you have a widely varying outcome. The easiest thing is to blame it on a generic, even though scientifically there really is no basis to suggest that generic small molecules are any different from brand name small molecules. But this is a familiar and appealing argument to practitioners, and it may indeed have some miles. This ignores the fact that in Europe they have about 20 biologics for the last decade that are being made available as biosimilars. And the experience overwhelmingly is that they're as safe and as effective as the drugs that they replaced. There have been no problems associated with the introduction of biosimilars. But getting the doctor on board is so critical. Why is that? Because biosimilars are not the same as generics, and the word biosimilar doesn't mean interchangeable. A biosimilar has to be approved by the FDA using all the criteria I just mentioned. But a further step would be interchangeable. There are no currently interchangeable biosimilars on the market today. An interchangeable biosimilar would be kind of like a generic. Your doctor writes you for Remicade, you get the generic version because it's cheaper. That isn't going to be the case. As a matter of fact, the FDA just put out its guidance for what would constitute interchangeability earlier this year in February, and they promised us that in less than 2 years they'll take into account the voluminous feedback they have and produce the final guidance. There will be a delay in interchangeability. That's really important because that means that if you want to get the biosimilar and you want to save some money, your doctor's going to have to write for that biosimilar. If they write for the brand name, nobody can change that doctor's order because they are not yet interchangeable. The next argument is, well, it isn't going to be that much money anyway. It's not going to save a lot of money for folks. And certainly when you see only a 15% discount and you're dealing in a world where people are getting 15 to 20% rebates, you start to wonder if it's going to make any difference in terms of cost overall. And yet there's that number from economists of $250 billion that could be saved by biosimilars. Thinking of a $250 billion haircut across the drug companies that make these things, you can understand why they're getting a little testy about it. So who's it going to save money for? That's interesting. Let's take a look at the numbers. If it costs between $25,000 and $200,000 a year for a specialty drug, and you're paying 20 to 33% of the cost under your insurance coverage, depending on your out-of-pocket maximum, if a biosimilar is 15% cheaper, might only be a savings of $750. The total amount might be $10,000 if you had a really large out-of-pocket max. If it's a 30% discount, the numbers are double, $1,500 to $20,000. Those are not insignificant dollars for most people. So when they say you're not saving a lot of money, obviously, they're not talking about you folks. It's saving you a lot of money. That isn't who they care about. Who do they care about? Well, it's the middlemen. And there are two kinds of ways you get these drugs. One is you get them at your doctor's office. And you get them at your doctor's office, and he charges your insurance company, or you, if you don't have any insurance, a fee for administering it to you, for sticking the needle in you and such. And he also marks up the cost of the drug that he's bought and he's kept in inventory. That's called the buy and bill model. That markup isn't much anymore. The feds have limited it to about 5% on the Medicare side with some machinations around that number. Maybe a little bit more than that in the commercial side, but they're not doubling the price of what they sell you. Nevertheless, it's based on the price of the drug. So if I get 10% of a $1,000 drug, I'm getting $100 for giving that to you. If I get 10% of a $10 drug, I'm getting $1. Obviously, there is some incentive to go with a higher priced drug. How big that incentive is based on the discounts that biosimilars offer, it's debatable. But buy and bill is largely going away for many people. The predominant model of delivering these sorts of pharmaceuticals is either you're giving them